as modern people, we can't assume, but we're maybe prone to assume that the druids knew everything and had
Hmm.
all magical powers just like whenever they needed them, like some kind of wizards, like wizards out of a fantasy book. What we know of them is that they were a learned class. They had methods of divination. We don't know how accurate their divinations were. They were lore keepers, they were judges, and so on. They were highly respected and very powerful. But that doesn't imply that they were almost godlike or anything. So, yesterday I offered a few tips about reading or listening to Celtic mythology. And the one which might be important in today's session is don't get hung up on identifying with one of the characters in a myth, which is what we naturally do when we read modern fiction. Try to look at the story more objectively and understand like the mechanisms that are at work in this story, the bigger picture, get up above the trees and look at what the big picture is. So I'll be telling a story later and you can try putting that into practice. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about the connections between Irish and Welsh mythology and a bit of personal explanation as to how that got to be so important to me. For those of you who are interested in Scotland, who might be frustrated at the lack of a separate group of Scottish deities, I hope that part of the talk might be helpful, and feel free to ask me questions specific to that when we get to the end and we have a Q&A and all of that. So I'm happy to talk about that as long as the day lasts. But before I launch into all of that, I am going to spend a couple of minutes, the dreaded part of free talks, of telling you about the classes I teach and what goes on in my Patreon. But I promise that'll take less than 5 minutes. So it's not going to be too long winded. And then we won't talk about that anymore. So I've been teaching about Celtic mythology and related things for quite a long time. In addition to teaching classes, I occasionally write articles and I make quite a few videos. And these get posted on my Patreon page. And some of them are open access, and some are early access for patrons, and some are permanently paywalled for patrons only. So I've learned over the years, though, that the majority of my patrons are more interested in supporting me than they are in getting the free stuff, the extra content. Most creators who use Patreon are saying the same thing. So I'm always kind of adjusting things because honestly, if I take the time to research and write an article or a video script, I want more than just a handful of people to see it. So I'm not going to go through all the benefits of all the different membership tiers here. It's there. You can click on the Patreon and read it where it says membership. The core tier for sort of interacting with me and getting a sort of monthly mini class is the $7 tier, the sturdy ponies. All the tiers have horse names. If you know me, you'll get that. So there are three higher tiers. The next ones, the haired leaders, add on an exclusive monthly video, and they get their names in the credits on YouTube on my videos. And above that are the magical horses, who add on a monthly one-to-one session for a tutorial just with me. And for $80, you get all of that, plus a free pass to any of my classes you want to enroll in, as many as you like. Magical horses and golden unicorns are quite rare, as I'm sure you know, but they do exist. I do sometimes get people kind of enrolling in the University of Chris Hughes for a while and taking tons of classes. So if that's you, you could save a bit of money. For most of the year, I'm usually running 3 or 4 different classes at different times in the week. And there are links to find these in the PDFs when you get them. If you're desperate to find out about classes and you can't find the PDF or something, you can literally put my name followed by Celtic mythology classes in a search engine and you'll find me. Over the course of the year, a few of my classes focus pretty specifically on Welsh or Brythonic topics. But even within these, I tend to highlight the connections between the material we're studying in that class and material from Ireland or Scotland where it exists. But most of the classes I teach are on some specific topic. And we'll look at what we can find out about that topic from the different Celtic speaking countries and regions. So I've got 4 classes coming up starting in the next week or so. Shapeshifters and magical animals is to do with stories of people who experience transformation into animal forms. And many of these stories have a strong mystical side, and we'll be concentrating on that quite a bit. This is an easy course to get you started, very beginner friendly. There's no reading for this course, and it's pay what you can. So all the upcoming classes have 6 sessions over about 7 weeks. There's a break around Samhain. So the price range for the pay what you can 6-week classes are from $30 up to $110. You pick your price. That works out to about $5 up to $18 per session. I'm also teaching Looking for Lugh, which talks about Lughs and the Lugoves on the continent. And then we start to dig into Irish and Welsh literature about Lugh and Llay and some of the other Brythonic reflexes. There's some reading for this class. All the reading is available online, so you don't need to buy anything extra. And this one is full price. So $95 for 6 weeks, $85 if you're a paying patron. And this one is near and dear to my heart, Mabon, Modron, and Maponos. So this is a deep dive into these 3 deities and others we consider to be their reflexes, including Matrona, Boan, Angus, Cunomaglos, a few others. These deities are pretty central to my own spiritual life, and I really enjoy studying them and sharing the latest stuff I've uncovered. So if you haven't taken the class for 5 years, you'll probably find some new things. This class does have some outside reading for some weeks, also available online, and it's also pay what you can. And this poor class is a bit undersubscribed this year. Maybe all the people on the planet who care about Mabon and Maponos have already taken the class. I don't know. So I hope a few of you will find it irresistible and decide to sign up. You can also come to just the opening session of this class as the Mysteries of Mabon as a standalone event. And there are some free tickets left for that. I make a certain number of tickets free for that event every year. So all of these classes are fairly beginner friendly. You don't need to worry about whether you know enough to participate. The 4th class is the Triads of Britain. There are a few requirements for this one. You really need some knowledge of the Mabinogion stories and knowledge of the Brythonic Old North, who some of the famous people are in that world, like the kings and their kingdoms and sort of that sort of thing. If you have that, you'll love this class. If you're a quick study and you maybe know about the Mabinogion, but not so much about the Old North, I can help you get ready, but the class starts on the 5th of September, so you need to be quick. Somebody signed up yesterday and I sent them a big stack of stuff, orientation. So this class also uses a textbook, Trioedd Anas Prydain by Rachel Bromwich. And it's currently between printings, but you can get an ebook. And this class requires some reading and independent study and sharing your findings with the class each week. So it's a bit demanding, and it's what I call one of my full participation classes. So I encourage you to fully participate in every class you take with me, because the discussions are so much richer with more people in them, and you'll learn far more. But you can just consume many of my classes digitally from the notes and recordings. Not this one, though. I expect you to show up and take part. Does anybody have any questions about classes or about the Patreon thing?
Just a sense, how long are the classes?
Between an hour and 2 hours, usually just over the hour, I would say, or maybe 90 minutes.
And is that the same for this today, our session?
Yeah, probably. This probably be a little bit shorter. Depends on the Q&A.
I signed up for the British Triads class yesterday. If I miss a day, is that okay? Because I learned this morning we might be going through an inventory audit at our store.
I think you're asking me, is it okay if you miss a class?
Yes.
Sure. So it's a little unpredictable for you. Just do your best. That's what I would say. You'll still get the recordings, but we will appreciate hearing your presentations if you're there. So I lived in Scotland, in Edinburgh, from the early 1980s until about 2009. At the start of that time, I began to develop my polytheist practice. For those of you who know anything about the history of Celtic polytheism, I was a little bit ahead of the group. So I didn't know anybody else who was doing that, right? I just said, okay, I'm going to worship gods. Point me at the gods. So at the start of that time, I didn't know what to do, but I had some background in related things and I started to study the myths. I had some background in folklore. At the time, I was working as a musician and music teacher. So at first, because Gaelic is one of Scotland's languages, I assumed that I'd sort of be worshipping Irish deities because Scotland gets its Gaelic language from Ireland, from Irish settlers. But I was aware that there were Roman era inscriptions to some deities in Scotland who are also known from Gaul, such as Maponos and Epona and Belinos. And over time, I began to realize that southern Scotland in particular had a clear and demonstrable shared history with Northern England and what is now Wales, because all those borders inside Britain, between Wales and Scotland and England, those are kind of high medieval constructs. They're not ancient. It was just Britain at one time, and lots of little petty kingdoms, fighting over territory and so on. So I added early Welsh literature and early history of North Britain to the list of things I needed to study. Over time, I found that I had a great affinity for the Brythonic material, maybe because I've found Welsh people are very open and generous about their culture in a similar way to the Scots. And of course, I lived in Britain, not Ireland. So the connections between Welsh and Irish stories run very deep. Some of them are to do with the broad sweep of a story. The Irish story of Macha being forced to run a race against horses and the story of Rhiannon have a lot in common. But because they're very different on the surface, the stories are very different on the surface. The immediately apparent details are very different. You don't necessarily notice it until you really start to study it. But with other stories, it's more like odd little details that turn up in both corpus, the Irish and the Welsh. You think, well, how did that get there? For example, in the Irish Book of Invasions, we learn that the goddess Breed possesses a wonderful boar. She possesses a number of fabulous breeding male animals, livestock, different things. And the boar that she has is called the Torc Triath. Now, the Welsh saga of Cilwch Olwen features a huge boar called the Tuath Truith. And several other pigs in that story also have Irish counterparts in the Dinhenachus, a collection of Irish place name lore. So what's going on? We know that by the early medieval period, if not before, Irish and Brythonic Celtic branches, language branches, had lost their mutual intelligibility. People couldn't understand each other. There may have been bilingual people, of course, but people couldn't just communicate. So there are three possible reasons for the similarity in Irish and Welsh stories. So it could be shared material from before the languages diverged. So back when there was a kind of Celtic mother language, way back in history. And that would make these things really, really old. Or Ireland borrowed from Britain. There's not a lot of evidence for that, with the exception of one or two late stories. Or the Britons borrowed from the Irish. And this seems more likely based on the work of scholars who should know, like Patrick Sims Williams. So let's think about the history and geography of this just a little bit. In antiquity, Celtic speakers were widespread over much of Europe. Obviously, these country borders are modern, but it's just to help you kind of orient yourself on the map. So they're all the way over east into Turkey and all the way south into Spain. And of course, Celtic speakers are in Britain and Ireland. No one fully understands the process of this. Linguists, archaeologists, geneticists, they're still trying to figure it out. There are theories, but no firm answers. So we just kind of have to live with that. We don't know whether it's migration or diffusion or conquest, but we can be pretty sure that language is a big vector for philosophy and mythology and religion. They don't always go hand in hand, but they often do, more often than not. But moving to Britain, we know that the Romans invaded in the 1st century AD. And around the same time, there seems to have been a migration of people from the province of Leinster in southeast Ireland to Gwynedd in North Wales, primarily to an area called the Llyn Peninsula, the little bit that sticks out, which you can also see enlarged up in the right-hand corner. So one of the names associated with these people is the Lan, or Line in modern Irish, which is still the Irish name for Leinster and probably cognate with the Welsh Llyn, the Llyn Peninsula. Now, the geographer Ptolemy wrote about these people back in the 2nd century as if they'd been there for at least a little while. He didn't say, oh, they've just gotten off the boat. So some of these people also settled in the Isle of Man up here and in other parts of, Northwest Wales. And a kind of subgroup called the Rechangi went to Flintshire, just a little bit further east, where they were associated with lead mining and smelting. So it's possible that these groups were able to gain a foothold, partly because Britain was destabilized by the Roman invasion. We don't know whether their arrival was peaceful or aggressive. Chances are a bit of both. And it may have begun even before the Romans arrived in Britain. So we can't be sure that it's anything to do with the Roman invasion. It might just be coincidental. But it wasn't a short stay. These settlers seem to have retained their Irish language and customs, though, to a great enough extent that they're still seen as distinctly Irish for several centuries after they begin to arrive. By the 3rd century, Christianity is becoming lightly established in Britain in Romanized areas. And then, of course, toward the end of the Roman occupation, a group from Cork called the Jaishi found themselves without a homeland. Now, the Jaishi were divided into a bunch of clans, and most of them managed to stay in Munster, although they were dispossessed of the land they had been on. So most of them managed to stay in Southwest Ireland, mostly through the clever machinations of a scary woman druid. Almost as a footnote to the story of the Jaishi, we hear that one offshoot of their nobility crossed the sea and settled in Dyfed. The one small paragraph in the text in a story called The Expulsion of the Jaishi deals with this and gives a long genealogy of the kings of Dyfed who descend from the original Jaishi leader of this group. And this genealogy is remarkably preserved intact, 11 generations worth, in one of the Welsh genealogical tracts as well. So we have some corroborating evidence from both sides. The dialect of Dyfed is also said to contain more Irish loanwords than the rest of Welsh. It's likely that Irish culture and stories contributed to the stories about Dyfed in the Mabinogi, like the story of Pwyll that we heard yesterday, and like the stories of Rhiannon and Pryderi and Manawyddan, which follow it in the 1st and 3rd branches of the Mabinogi, which are about Dyfed. Now, stories set in North Wales, in the 2nd and 4th branches of the Mabinogi, also have a lot in common with Irish stories. There are many connections and similarities. And the 2nd branch is about going to Ireland, Irish king coming to Wales. All this settlement may account for the similarity of stories, but if so, how did it happen? And why are the Welsh stories so different? Well, we know that the druids were the main lore keepers or memory workers, and they were largely destroyed as any kind of cohesive force within the culture by the Romans, but only in Britain, not in Ireland. In Ireland, the Romans never really did anything much. But in Ireland, Christianity slowly eroded the power of the Druids, but that took many centuries. It wasn't a holocaust of an event like it was in Britain. The Roman conquest of Gaul and parts of Britain, kind of amounted to a cultural genocide. Things were only a little bit better in Britain than they were in Gaul. In what is now West Wales, these groups from Ireland, they rock up, they come from a culture which has been undisturbed so far by outside influences. But there are linguistic problems, and it probably took time for the two groups to really start mixing and sharing their stories. By this time, the Britons have likely lost a lot of their stories due to the loss of their lore keepers, due to the Roman invasion, upsetting their culture. So their stories will be degraded, even though they might not be conscious of their Celtic brotherhood with the Irish, which we don't think they were. The Irish stories must have felt kind of familiar, Bits of them were like bits of remembered stories from their own culture, consciously or more likely unconsciously. This material provided building blocks for the Britons to sort of rebuild their mythology and shore it up. So these stories were in time preserved by the court bards and storytellers of the Britons, as well as influencing the folk tales of the poorer classes. So this feels to me like a plausible overarching scenario. We're never going to totally get down to the nitty gritty of the details. Celtic scholars of the 19th and early 20th century did a lot of wild guessing when they began to notice this stuff. And some of their ideas are completely discredited. But more recent work by John Carey in Ireland and Patrick Sims-Williams in Wales and others, it's been a lot more forensic and trustworthy. However, there's still a lot we don't understand about the process. So if I started giving you examples more than I've given you so far, I'd have to tell you bits of lots of different stories, and I'm not sure that would be very satisfying. I think it could be a bit confusing. What I will do, though, is I'll give you some things you can follow up on in the PDF, where, especially videos where I talk about the comparisons between different stories and their, graphics and things, and it's easy to follow. Yesterday, I told you a story, and you practiced your objective listening. And we discussed the meaning of the story a bit, with me mostly telling you what I thought it meant, right? So I'm going to tell you another story now, and I'm going to tell it quite plainly, without much drama. So it's not going to be fantastic storytelling. It's going to be kind of a recounting, just as we find it in the medieval texts. So when I'm done, I'll throw out some questions to you to see what you think it means. So this story is from Ireland. It's about a famous early king called Conn of the 100 Battles. So one morning, Conn was walking the royal ramparts of Tara, and it was his habit to go there early in the morning before sunrise, together with his 3 druids and his 3 Fili, that is, his poets. And they used to rise early every day and keep watch, lest the men of the Sidhe capture Ireland. Well, this morning, Conn stepped a little off his usual path, and he happened to put his foot on a certain stone. And the stone cried out beneath his feet over and over, and so loudly that it was heard throughout Tara and beyond. Well, Conn questioned his druids as to why the stone had cried out and what its history could be. And the druids said that Conn would have to wait for the answer to this. Well, he waited, and after 53 days had passed, the druids finally spoke to him. Fall, that is destiny, is the name of the stone. It was brought from the island of Fall, and it is in Tara of the land of destiny that it was placed. It is in the land of Taltu, what we now call Teltown, that it will remain until the day of judgment. And it is in that land that there will be a festive assembly for as long as there is kingship in Tara. And the ruler who does not find the stone on the last day of the assembly will be a doomed man in that year. Fall cried out beneath your feet, said the druid, and prophesied. The number of cries which the stone uttered is the number of kings that there will be of your race until the day of judgment. And it is not I who will name them to you, said the druid. After this conversation, a great mist came down so that they couldn't see anything. And they heard the noise of a horseman riding toward them. Woe is us, said Con, if he brings us into an unknown land. And then the horseman cast 3 spears in their direction. He's trying to wound the king, said the druid. How dare he make a cast at Con in Tara? And then the horseman came up to them, and they could see him in the mist. And he greeted Con, and he invited him and his druids and poets to come with him to his dwelling. He seemed a phantom of the mist to Con and his people, but they followed him until they were on a wide plain where there was a golden tree growing. And they saw a fine house there with a ridgepole of white bronze 30 feet in length. And they were taken into the house, and they saw a beautiful young woman there on a golden throne, wearing a golden crown. At her feet was a silver vat with hoops of gold around it, full of red ale. There was a dipper of gold hanging on the vat, and a gold cup stood before the woman. The phantom himself was sitting on a throne also. They had never seen a man in Tara of his size or his beauty. His form was fair and his appearance wondrous. And then he said to them, I am no ghost or phantom. I have come on account of my fame among you since my death. My name is Lugh, son of Ethu. I have come to speak to you of the length of your reign, Con, and of every reign which there will be in Tara. And the girl who sat before them in the house was the sovereignty of Ireland. And she offered food to Con, the rib of an ox and the rib of a boar. The ox rib was 24 feet long and 8 feet between its arc and the ground. And then she began to distribute drinks, and she said, to whom shall the cup of the ale of sovereignty be given? And the phantom told her it should be given to Con. And then Lugh named every ruler in Tara, from Con until the day of judgment. And Con's poet Kesarn inscribed their names in Ogham on staves of yew as Lugh spoke. And then the house and Lugh and the girl all disappeared. Con and his people looked around them and saw that the vat and the golden dipper and the cup were left with Con. So I want to open this up, but I'll fire some questions at you. And my first question to you is, what do you think this story says about Irish ideas of kingship? Don't all rush at once.
It feels like it's trying to say they need some divine connection for that king to truly be the king. If he doesn't have the access to sovereignty, then he is not king.
Great, great.
With Lugh mostly speaking to cons and such, I was wondering about the young woman sitting next to him. It's like maybe she had more to have influence on it than the story indicates. Maybe some of her, the power coming from more from her and stuff. That and Lugh's kind of acting like a liaison between Con and her.
Yeah, in a way he is, isn't he? He's almost like her messenger. That's a good observation.
Not only is there a lineage, and the king's also got to marry the land, basically. You can't rule without the permission of the goddess, really, and the land. You can't rule separately to that.
This story doesn't emphasize that. I mean, we gather this from many other stories, including a later story about Con and his son Art. It's interesting what this story emphasizes and what it doesn't emphasize. And for those of you who know a bit about the whole idea of Celtic sovereignty, kings, and all of this, then it's difficult to separate what you see just in the story from that, nor should you. Anybody else got any thoughts? What does it say about Irish ideas of kingship?
Well, it seems like there's a bit of a contrast because, first of all, there is this sense of destiny. I mean, if I'm saying ahead of time who the lineage is going to be that the kingship is passing through, there is that destiny piece. But earlier, it talked about the stepping on the stone at the feast. And should the king not find that stone by the end of the feast, then it would be poorly. I don't remember exactly what it was, but
He'll die within the year. Yeah.
there you go. So there is a sense, though, that one, it's destiny, but still there still seems to be that inkling of a testing aspect, which is part of the I guess the sovereignty complex to begin with. So.
Yeah. So why might the emphasis in this story be more on destiny and less on the compact with the sovereignty goddess? So think about that.
The observation I made was that, and perhaps this may have been in order to help the subjects of the king sort of be more comfortable with the fact they were ruled, is that the king themselves is also subject to a higher power. So it's not like they're, on the top of this pyramid and no one can tell them what. They sort of have to also listen to someone above them. It's sort of more fair, I suppose. And if you were to tell that story to the people, if they were to hear that, it's like, oh, well, we listen to him, he listens to the above, and so on.
It's interesting that in the Brehon laws, which have some really interesting things to say about Irish kingship, the king is not described as for example, as a lawgiver. He is a keeper of the law. He is a servant of the law. He is a servant of his people in many ways.
Could the story be based on some sort of Druidic ritual? There's the mention of the Four Hallows within this story. You've got the spear of Lugh, cup like the Grail, the stone. It could be a Druidic ritual story.
Well, I think you might also be onto something. I mean, we have evidence from the grave goods of some very high status Celtic burials, particularly the Lady of V, who was buried with both a wagon and a huge wine vat. It's 5 feet tall and a number of cups and strainers and things. So you can't help but think of the Lady of V when you read this story, and it's kind of assumed, guessed perhaps by archaeologists, that she may have been some kind of ceremonial figure, whether she was a sovereign or some kind of priestess or royal lady whose job it was to perhaps serve drink at royal events or even at the inauguration of a king. Now, has anybody thought about this question? Why might the emphasis in this story be put on destiny and kind of we know who's fated to be king for generations to come, as opposed to making a compact with the sovereignty goddess? Any thoughts about that? So in many of the sovereignty tales we have, for example, Rhiannon coming into Davad and marrying Puig, it feels much more like the male ruler is chosen by the goddess. Yeah. This doesn't seem to be what's happening here. She's saying, to whom should this cup of ale of sovereignty be given? Like, shall I give it to this guy? So it's an interesting twist.
Part of me feels like it's supposed to either legitimize the rule of each successive king, so to speak. But part of me also wonders if it was written retrospectively to say, okay, these kings from the past, going back further and further, that's how and why they became king of Ireland, or so to speak.
Possibly.
My thoughts are perhaps that it was like, rather than making this compact and him being determined and him thinking that he's already got the rule. There seems to be some trial down the line that perhaps involves a whole bunch of people who have been communicated to in such a way, perhaps, and it's more of an invitation to the ball than like a being awarded the best dancer, retrospectively, beforehand, right? Not retrospectively.
Yeah, I can't disprove what you're saying, but I certainly can't think of any much evidence for what you're saying.
I might be misremembering this, but I think, didn't the prophecy not come true?
Yeah, absolutely. No, we don't know any. All the names are listed in the text, and everybody's like, "Who?" Which is bizarre in itself.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. When we look at mythological texts, which are also medieval literature, which all of the Irish and Welsh stuff we have is, we need to look at its context. Is this a change in thinking about destiny that's partly from the influence of Christianity? They're letting go of, but have not really let go of, the idea of the sovereignty goddess confirming kingship, but they've kind of reshaped it a little. They've toned it down a little bit so that you could also say, kind of in parallel to this, they wouldn't conflict that much. You could also say Con is destined to be king. He's a bit early. It's supposedly pre-Christian, but our kings are destined to be the king because God has chosen them. And we could still have the ceremonial aspect of a sovereignty figure, a supernatural sovereignty figure, confirming that by giving them a drink of ale and them getting a gold cup or whatever. Yeah. So that's my guess.
Earlier in the story, you talk about the men of the she. She is another term for the people of the other world, right? Or am I misreading that?
What I was wondering about with, it's kind of changed. I wonder if maybe with the influence of Christianity, I do wonder if like there's a certain amount of free will going on depending on what each king does and how that can turn destiny against him or turn it in his favor and so on, keep his line going or not.
Yeah, well, later in the cycle of the kings, there's a story called The Adventures of Art, Son of Con. And if you want to look at 12 Days of Celtic Mythology, Season 1, I dissect this story over 12 sessions, and really, take all the bits apart and see what makes it tick. It's definitely a sovereignty tale of Con holding on to power too long and falling out of favor with the sovereignty goddess. So that's interesting. I mean, it in no way ever refers to the story we just heard. It never says, remember when, that happened. It never, this story may even be newer than the adventures, more recent, than the adventures of Art. It's never a done deal. So, guys, what does it say about how Lugh is perceived?
They're describing him as this very beautiful, very radiant person. Is he supposed to be a Christ-like figure in this sense? Is it supposed to be maybe they're changing the myth to suit their needs for that? I don't. It's kind of confusing.
When Lugh's appearance is described, he's always beautiful and blingy and bright. So I think, if anything, it's just,
Is this the same Lugh as Lugus, the Lugh Longhand?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that makes more sense now. Okay, sorry.
Lugh, yeah.
And so they show him casting those spears, right, at them in the mist. So they're tying it into his attributes, I guess, subtextually.
Yeah,
right?
Lugh does a lot of spear casting, especially in Irish folklore. It's difficult to know exactly what the point of that is, other than perhaps it begins to identify Lugh in the story. But perhaps the thing is that he can cast the spears. He doesn't wound anybody. He doesn't hurt anybody. I mean, there's 7 of them standing there. That's in itself, if the casts are close and they're all missing and it's very misty, suggests his extreme skill with those spears. Hearkening back a bit to Freny, who puts the needle at the leg of a wren, one of the tiniest birds that exists, and the needle goes precisely between the bone and the sinew of the poor wren's leg. It's an extremely skilled cast. But what else do you think? What do you think it says about Lugh more generally? Let's get off his how he looks.
Just regarding the accuracy, he says who to give the cup to, right? So perhaps it's his role to be the one who ensures like the decisions are accurate, right? Like hey, like what should I do? And it's like, well, this is where it should go, right? Like I'm good at accuracy, so this is the cup should go to him, right? And I'm true in saying this.
Maybe, yeah.
Just to say that he's partnered with the sovereignty of Ireland. So there is a sense of him perhaps being this otherworldly king and within that partnership. And so perhaps that speaks to his role as ensuring that this world king is worthy. Or
It's usually Manannán that we find meddling in who gets to be king of something. It's interesting to hear it's Lugh.
Well, Lugh himself was the king of the Tuatha De Danann until he died. Like his kingship follows Bresse's. So maybe when he dies, he kind of like retains that sort of office in the other world, where he's like more directly connected to Ireland, where like Manannán's kind of more of like outside of Ireland, sort of.
Lugh is an interesting divinity in that. So his father is of the Tuatha De Danann. His mother is of the Fomhra, the Fomorians, who are kind of the enemy of the Tuatha De Danann. Are they a supernatural race? Are they a mortal race? Do we know? Not really. But it's interesting that, we have a death story for Lugh. He's killed by the sons of Kermit. But of course, Lugh reappears, not only this time, but he reappears in the Ulster cycle to father Cuchulainn and then later to help Cuchulainn while he's doing his single combat stuff. Yeah, Lugh just keeps, we expect him at any moment. And maybe that is a bit Christ-like in a way, but I'm not sure that's where it comes from. It's just like Lugh is a figure that you can't permanently kill him.
Regarding Manannán, perhaps, from my understanding, he's sort of a boundary keeper between the realms, right? So this mist that comes about, he's also associated with having this cloak of mist that he hides the kings behind after their rule is done or they die or whatever. I think maybe there could be some suggestion of not meddling, but facilitation from Manannán within this.
I like that idea. Manannán's not a meddler, he's a facilitator. I'm sure he sees it that way. That's brilliant. I do question, though, I think the idea of Manannán as some kind of keeper of the realms or something is a modern construct. Now, I see how you might interpret some things in some texts to kind of create that idea, but I don't think it's really inherent in the myths. So that's ultimately my opinion.
Now that I know it's Lugh Longhand, he has a, pun intended, he has a hand in changing the history of Ireland throughout his entire life. His birth is prevented by Balor. His raising is prevented by Balor. And then when he finally strikes him down, he changes the course of history for the Ireland itself. And now he's also causing change in the choosing of kings, sort of to speak.
Maybe, yeah. So here's another question for you. What does this story say about the status of poets and druids?
They're the right and left hand of the king, so to speak. He has 3 poets and 3 druids with him on his journey around his castle or his keep at all times. So they're there to advise him. They're there to be with him. So he has to have them in order to pass judgment, maybe?
Oh, probably. Yeah, possibly.
I don't know that it necessarily means anything, but I'm fascinated by the detail that they wanted 53 days to give him an answer. And even when they give him an answer, like, we're not going to be the ones that give you the detailed answer of the future. That just seemed very out of character for most druids we run across within the stories, who seem to have all their stuff ready at the moment and also are more than happy to give you a list of all the things they know.
I suppose it is unusual. When I tell this story and I'm a little freer and I I add a little bit more drama to it. I always make quite a bit out of that. What might the druids and poets be doing during that 53 days? Were they doing divination? Were they fasting? And all this to try and come up with the answer. It implies that they don't know the answer, doesn't it? And that they have to go away and prognosticate. Literally in the text, it says, "We will tell you in 53 days." What it means.
It's implied that their presence is needed to deal with the good folk, I'm not sure if to see them coming or to defend against their attempts to seize Ireland.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it in that way. So I have this imagination. This is just, this is what happens. You get your own idea about what a story means. So my idea has always been that Conn is a young king. He knows he needs wisdom. This time every morning on the ramparts with his druids and poets is a time for them to talk to him and impart wisdom to them where they're not interrupted by the pressures of kingship and daily life in the court. But of course, that's just my imagining. But yeah, it does quite clearly say that they're up there to watch out for the Sidhe, so they don't take Ireland back.
It's the thought that here you're not seeing the druids in a central role, though. They're no longer, the knowledge is limited. They don't know the names of the kings, etc. So there's that feeling that, is this the influence of the Christian scholars who are writing this story, downplaying the role of the druidic beliefs?
I wouldn't have said so. I would have said that as modern people, we can't assume, but we're maybe prone to assume that the druids knew everything and had all magical powers just like whenever they needed them, like some kind of wizards, like some kind of wizards out of a fantasy book. What we know of them is that they were a learned class. They had methods of divination. We don't know how accurate their divinations were. They were lore keepers, they were judges, and so on. They were highly respected and very powerful. But that doesn't imply that they were almost godlike or anything. Yeah. I think it's not unreasonable for them to say, we'll let you know in 53 days. They may also, of course, be exerting their power by saying that. They may be saying, yeah, we'll let you know when we're ready to let you know. We want to be sure we give you the right answer. And just chill.
53 just seems like a really arbitrary number. I'm just curious if there's any significance to that at all. I mean, it's not even a multiple of 3 or 9 or 7 or like a month or it's just does it show up anywhere else? I've never.
Not to my knowledge. I've always puzzled over that. And there's a couple of texts of this, and the 53 is stable in the different texts.
So maybe it is saying what you're saying, like they have the right to be arbitrary because of their status, and they can take the time they need, or whatever that teaches.
I'm not a mathematician, but I would think that 53 is one of those. It's what called a prime number. So it's not divisible by anything.
My thoughts are on that number as well, and perhaps it was just that in 53 days it would align with a particular part of the lunar cycle. And that was the time for it to be revealed. It wasn't the time now because the moon's not right, the stars aren't right, but it will be right in 53 days, right? When this specific, waning, waxing, full, whatever, dark moon.
Yeah, that's a possibility. At the moment where they were standing in 50, but then it should be within a 28-day cycle, you'd think, maybe it had something to do with the moon and the Pleiades or something, who knows? But that's a good point. I also think, though, that we mustn't take this story too literally. Yeah, it's a myth. And I'm not saying, therefore, it's just made up bullshit and it's untrue completely, but I don't think we should take the minutiae of what's said in the story as all having literally happened. Yeah.
The other time that 53 occurs in Irish mythology is the Caesarians, who were the first settlers of Ireland. 50 women and 3 men.
Oh, well done.
Yeah. And
go to the head of the class. why might the druids and the poets be grouped together like this? So he goes every morning with his 3 druids and 3 poets.
My guess is the druids are there to help him with advice, and then they have the bards who are there to either they come up, they may use it as inspiration time. If he does some great deed, they can remember, they can be there to remember it.
My thoughts are that the druids were there for their foresight potential or symbols or abilities, and the poets were there for employing satire against the approaching enemies to curse them.
That's a good point. Yeah. So as well as satirizing bad kings, poets did sometimes scream satires on the battlefield at the enemy. You're all short and ugly and you can't fight with beans.
Yeah, the actual king's reign was tied up with what the poets actually wrote down about him. His reign would come abruptly to an end if the poets set aside their own king.
I'm still wondering, why are the druids and the poets grouped together?
So just taking the text at its own face, they were there in order to keep the Sidhe in check in some way. It may have had some sort of similarity to like the Breton laws where you had certain officers who had certain roles, and thus they had to have 3 of each of those to be in correspondence with whatever role they were playing out.
I don't know if this is helpful, a weird distinction that means something to me. As you're thinking about this question, maybe try and think less about what they do and more about what they are.
The bards are the memory well for the king. They memorize things. They orate the written or the spoken history since they didn't have writing as much back then. And the druids would be the priestly class to kind of divinate what the bard should say, possibly. But why
there should
is
be
there
some truth to that in the Irish paradigm, medieval Irish paradigm. As the centuries roll by, the druids do get kind of downgraded from high nobility priestly class to kind of court magician, it's a kind of imperceptible loss of status that no doubt has something to do with Christianity.
Just that they represent agents of legitimacy, don't they?
Yeah,
both groups, both the poets and the druids, Con needs them for being able to show everybody else that he's covered all his bases. He is the right person for the right job, so to speak.
Can anyone recall, just because I'm obviously in some very learned company here, can anyone recall, I'm pretty sure it's Caesar, who describes the 3 kinds of druids? Can anybody remember, kind of just paraphrase what that says?
If I remember correctly, he describes them as specifically the druids, the ovates, and the bards. They're all part of the same, not same class, but they have to work together with one another, correct?
Yeah, I think they are a part of the same class, actually. Can anybody remember just a little bit of detail? You don't need to give me an essay. So he says something like there's 3 classes of druids: the druids, the bards, and the ovates. There's a category within a category there. He doesn't say much, but what does he kind of say about those 3 groups?
Druids were meant to be the judges and rule keepers, and the Philly or the bards are supposed to keep the storytellers and poetry as far in general genealogies and praise poets and all that. And the ovates were kind of like the ones who did divination and were able to both learn omens and be able to take note of that, and as far as how a kingship could be ruled and such. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing maybe badly.
Yeah, but I think you're close. Well done, but I'm a little bit garbled.
I actually was on the right track. I was the bards were the historians, the ovates were the law keepers, and the druids were the stargazers.
Okay, so the druids are the kind of the highest rank, if you like, kind of the druids, and they seem to be the law keepers and the rule makers to some extent. The bards, you absolutely got it right. I think everybody kind of got that right. They're kind of like historians. They memorize everything. They do praises of the kings and so on. The ovates are kind of, I think the druids are also described as having something to do with moral philosophy, which I think we would call like philosophy or ethics, right? And then the ovates seem to be interested in things like divination and the natural sciences. So whatever that meant to people at the time, understanding the world around them, yeah, understanding the natural world around them. That's the druids in antiquity. That's not necessarily the druids in medieval Ireland. But why are these druids, who are maybe now more like prognosticators or magicians, a little bit, why are they in, and the Fili, the bards, as we would say in Welsh, why are they hanging around with the king? Why isn't he up there with his knights or his, whatever? And why are they all grouped in one group?
I know that bards and druids were exempt from military service. Is that
Yeah,
have something to do with it?
I don't think so. Okay, I'll put you out of your misery. If we look at the career of the bards in Wales, the court bards, and the court poets, the Fili in Ireland, it appears that as time goes on and the status of the official druids is lowered by the Romans, who didn't like them because they fomented rebellion, and the Christians, who didn't like them because they were in competition of a different religion, the poets take on a lot of the kind of mantle of druidry. They become the lore keepers. They become involved in law and lawmaking, in making kind of magical threats like their satires and so on. I think that's why they're all grouped together, is because there's clearly a connection between the two groups. I'm seeing a few people nodding, and I'm seeing a few people going, "What?" So please ask me a question if you'd like, because I don't know what you might be questioning about what I've just said.
Are you suggesting perhaps that as the druids were downgraded and the poets took over, perhaps it was because a poet could kind of veil themselves within the role of like a narrative teller, and it's fiction, it's poetry, but a druid was like very, very much so not that, right? Like it was a much more, and it was very clear. But a poet
Yes,
or a bard can just hang out in the bar and play the songs, and it's entertainment, right? And it's kind of veiled by things that the Romans enjoy,
yeah.
listening to beautiful music while they drink.
I think, yeah, it's a little bit like that. I think you're kind of in the right ballpark.
Well, the bards were carriers of culture, right? They were the archive. They were your external hard drive, as you will. Mm-hmm. So perhaps the druidic traditional role of judgment and law keeping, as it were, was downgraded over time, but the bards would have memorized those laws as well. So they would have had the context that the king would have needed. They would have been able to cite the laws, even if they weren't in that role specifically as of a judge in that moment.
I think that's really, yeah, that's a good encapsulation, and especially put together with what Jason already said. The bards are officially more secular. They don't necessarily have any connection to pre-Christian religion per se. Although when you read the Book of Taliesin, you do wonder, to say that they're like secret agents of the old religion or they're underground druids or something is going too far to say this about the bards and the Fili. But it is a little like that. Or they, like I say, they kind of take on the mantle and continue to do that cultural work, which includes a lot of ceremonial stuff around king making and kings, consolidating their power once they're in power, and so many things that are important for culture, for keeping the culture going.
Were the poets there maybe as sort of like witnesses to be like, yeah, no, the king wasn't tripping. There actually were fairies trying to come and take Ireland from us. You know.
Maybe. That I don't know. And well, we can certainly see even in the time of like the 12th century in Wales, that the bards hold a lot of power and are very unafraid to be in conflict with the clergy, not necessarily over religion. They're not necessarily saying we represent the old pagan religion, but they're saying we're actually a lot smarter than you. We know more than you. We hold more cultural and possibly esoteric knowledge than you do. Well, some of them, at least, Llywarch ap Llywelyn is completely unafraid to represent himself that way. There's still a great deal of power held by these classes. And, we know also in Ireland a bit earlier that because in Ireland, satire was such a common weapon of the Fili, that kings were reluctant to not give them anything they wanted. They were kind of holding it was a bit of blackmail going on, that the bards would say, well, if you don't host us in your court, to whoever it is, for the winter, and feed me and my 17 apprentices, and give us all some nice cloaks and horses and stuff, then we're going to satirize you. Well, the kings were getting fed up with this in the time of Columba, and actually asked Columba to banish them from their courts, and Columba wouldn't do it, according to lore, because they were the keepers of the culture. So this has been a really good discussion. I do want to just bring us back briefly to yesterday's story, which, for those of you who weren't here, you probably are familiar with it. It's Puig's trip to Annúbhyn at the beginning of the Mabinogi. Yeah. And think about how these two stories are similar. They're not alike. That would be going much too far. What can you see? Just little pick and mixes. What can you see between that story and this story that are in various ways related or similar?
In both stories, the other world clearly has an influence on what's going on. So we have to have both things in sync and both decisions getting made for the cycle to go forward, possibly.
Yeah.
Well, I think one big thing is that the other world and this world are very close together, and you could enter into it at any time. So there are places and situations of liminality. So the mist is a liminality that brings them, but they're on the same hill, but on a different layer. Same thing, Puig wanders into Annúbhyn unknowing. It looks just like our world, and you could say similar. I mean, it's richly appointed. There's gold and white. There are these signatures that indicate that we're dealing with the other worlds. But aside from the richness, it's very similar to this world in a sense. There are homes and there are feasts and there are tables. It's not something completely alien. It's this but better. Yeah.
I think, we can say, okay, they're both lured to the other world by what we would call a deity, right? I think we can agree that Lugh is divine and Arawn is considered probably to be a divinity also. When they get there, they meet a beautiful woman whom they dine with in a very ceremonial fashion, because of course, it's a courtly. It's a court. It's a divine or royal or both court. And they both come away changed and with their sovereignty more confirmed and their friendship with the other world more confirmed. Although I've talked today about how Irish and Welsh stories are alike, I'm not particularly saying that this story would have influenced the story of Puig in Annúbhyn. I think this is a case where we really can say this kind of thinking probably does have its roots in very early Celtic thought. Witness what we were talking about with the Lady of V. That's spelled V-I-X. If you want to Google Lady of V, V-I-X, you will soon know what I'm talking about if you don't. So I think we'll leave it there. What a great conversation this has been. I'll just do everything for free, and then 40 smart people will come and we'll all chat. I don't know how I'll pay my bills, unfortunately, if I do that.
And if I can, I wanted to add one more piece because you mentioned the Lady of V. I've been spending a lot of time in Gaul lately. There is the goddess Rosmerta, who is the great provider is what we think her name is, and she's often paired with Mercury, who is syncretized with Lugus. And one of her attributes, one of the things she's often pictured with, is a vat. And we think it might be a vat of mead. So, we were talking about the idea that this conference of sovereignty and these otherworldly figures and all of this, has its roots in very old, potentially the core Celtic culture. I think we see this in this early period. So it's got to be, I don't know what year this or what century this story is from, but this is first century, second century iconography of a goddess very similar, paired with the same divinity. And we have the resonance of that too with the sovereignty goddesses in Llay. I look at Blodeuwedd as a seasonal sovereignty goddess. But that the pairing is there, and that Llay or Lugh or Lugus is involved, and then the vat is present. Just wanted to add that piece.
Oh, that was really interesting. I hadn't thought about Rosmerta and Mercury with reference to this story, and this is why it's good to talk. Okay, well, I think we'll say goodbye, and thank you so much for coming to my TED Talk. And I'm sure I'll see most of you around somewhere before too long. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.